From the nation's capital, the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research presents Public Policy Forums, a series of programs featuring the nation's top authorities presenting their differing views on the vital issues which confront us. Today's topic, the future of urban centers. What are the policy options?
I'm Peter Hackus in Washington. Many of the nation's oldest cities are in trouble. More affluent homeowners and businesses flee to the suburbs. The inner cities find their tax bases eroding and social problems multiplying. There are two schools of thought as to what should be done. One calls for governmental action to revitalize the inner cities, to reestablish their former positions as the centers of our nation's commerce and culture. The other says urban centers should be left alone to seek some natural and perhaps new form of life, even if this means the disappearance of many features of these cities as we used to know them. The administration, the Congress, and state and local governments are all feeling the pressure from all sides to come up with a plan for the future of cities. The panelists on our program have dealt with these problems in their roles as representatives of state, local, and national government. Welcome to another Public Policy Forum presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and education organization. This roundtable discussion will explore the topic, the future of urban centers. What are the policy options? Appearing on our panel are Senator Mark Hatfield. Senator Hatfield, a Republican from Oregon, is a member of the Senate Appropriations Committee, which must approve government spending for cities. He is a former two-term governor of Oregon and has served in the Senate since 1966. Father Geno Baroni. Father Baroni is Assistant Secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development for Neighborhoods, Voluntary Associations, and Consumer Protection. Prior to joining HUD in 1977, Father Baroni, a Roman Catholic priest, served as president of the National Center for Urban Ethnic Affairs. Senator Richard Lugar. Senator Lugar, a Republican from Indiana, is on the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. He is a former mayor of Indianapolis, having served in that position for 8 years. During that period, he was chosen president of the National League of Cities. Mayor Richard Hatcher. Mayor Hatcher is in his third term as mayor of Gary, Indiana. He has served as vice president of the National Conference of Democratic Mayors and as a member of the advisory committee of the National League of Cities. Mayor Hatcher has also served on several committees of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. John Charles Daly is our moderator. Mr. Daly is a former news correspondent and commentator for both CBS News and ABC News. Mr. Daly headed the Voice of America and is a former ABC Network vice president. Now, here is Mr. Daly.
This Public Policy Forum, part of a series presented by the American Enterprise Institute, is concerned with the future of urban centers. What are the policy options? Well, an ancient adage holds that the road to the nether regions is paved with good intentions. It may be said equally that the way to solution of our urban problems has been paved with good intentions and frustration and failure. The multiplicity of programs, the commitment of huge sums in the 1960s and 70s appear to have made little difference except, some argue, to make things worse. Instead of progress and prosperity, there have been depression and demoralization, and what was once urgently debated as the urban problem is now often described as the urban crisis. The air is alive with demands for new concepts and approaches to arrest and ease, if not erase, the blight on major elements of urban America, where some 70% of our people live and labor. In White House conference, leagues of cities, cabinet meetings, mayors' conferences, national forums, a new way is sought, and our question is, what are the options? To establish a broad base for the dialogue, gentlemen, will you each in turn briefly address the question, what is your assessment of the urban crisis and why have we failed to find a solution? Senator Hatfield.
Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, I want to say to John Charles Daly that the problem is bigger than a bread box, but the effort has probably been smaller. I feel that the problem has been basically related to what the sociologists tell us that is the greatest sense of loss in our American culture today, and that is a loss of a sense of community. That people have increasingly felt disconnected, lack of relevance in their daily life, and as a consequence, they have sensed a loss of actual power or decision-making over their daily lives. Into this picture has come some well-motivated and well-meaning programs, and I don't think they have all failed at all. I think some of them have been more successful than others. But I think that many times people feel that they have come from outside of their community, outside of the urban center. It is imposed upon them by the bureaucrats from Washington or even the impersonal bureaucracy in the state capitals or the county courthouses, and all arrogance of bureaucracy is not found in those, but some have even been found in City Hall. And so as a consequence, the decision-making power and the location of power has been increasingly removed from where the people live. And therefore, I think that the success that we must look for will be found more frequently in the models that we create that are people-oriented, people-focused, in which the people themselves have helped make the determination, the decisions, and to help design the programs. And as we create these smaller models of life and scale, I think that people will sense a greater understanding of power, that it is there upon them and they must exercise it. Which led me to introduce my neighborhood government corporation concept in the early 70s. I do not offer this as a simple panacea, but only as an illustration of trying to empower people, once again, with some control over the destiny of their life.
Senator Lugar.
Mr. Daly, I would say that things are not worse. As a matter of fact, I think that many programs that have been initiated in several administrations have been largely very successful in bringing about new income, new jobs, new potential in our cities. As broadly defined, as you have mentioned it in your introduction, that 70% of our people live in urban areas. This means not only the cities that you're discussing, but suburbs, the whole infrastructure associated with that. And I think it's demonstrable that people in America, the 70% who are in urban areas, are substantially better off than they were 5 or 10 years ago. Now, there is an urban crisis in some cities, principally northeastern cities, and within those urban areas, the interior portions, the inner cities, where buildings are old, where industry has changed, and where employment opportunities have not necessarily been regenerated. And I think a part of our problem in talking about the urban crisis is one of definition. It is acute for individual Americans and for certain neighborhoods and even cities of some size. But it is not acute for most, has not been for a long time, will probably never be. And therefore, rifle shot approaches are of the essence. And I would say we had best take a look keenly at geography, at age, and at the structural viability of cities. It would appear to me very important, although not a panacea, that those areas within urban areas that are having economic distress will need to be merged with other areas that are stronger. And the politics of that sort of change comes very hard. But the politics of what we're talking about elsewise, of more expenditure, comes very hard too, I think, at this point. And it just seems to me that the problem has been largely structural, geographic, and economic in terms of job opportunities. And although much progress has been made, that's where we ought to look in our initiatives now.
Mayor Hatcher.
Well, I believe that there is an urban crisis, but I share the belief of Senator Lugar that that crisis is not necessarily a comprehensive one. It does not apply to every city, and it does not impact on every city in precisely the same way. Basically, cities in certain regions of the country are experiencing some extremely serious problems that relate to outmigration of population, outmigration of businesses, and on the other hand, in other areas of the country, the problem is more related to the problems of rapid growth, rapid and uncontrolled growth. I think a number of factors, if we could confine ourselves for a moment to the Midwest, the Northeast, the older cities in the country, a number of factors have brought them to the stage of crisis that they are experiencing today. Among those factors are the natural inclination on the part of a number of people who have the opportunity to improve themselves, improve their status in life. They have naturally moved out of those centers, and in some cases they represented perhaps the strongest part of the community. Secondly, it would be extremely difficult to discuss the problems of America's cities without discussing the problem of racism, ongoing racism that continues to exist in this country. And many of the decisions that have been made in relation to policies that impact upon those cities have been dictated in large part by certain racial attitudes that unfortunately continue to persist. In addition to that, some of our policies at the federal level have had a negative effect, and I'm not talking at this point about many of the categorical programs of the 60s and some of the different approaches of the 70s, the block grant, general revenue sharing, and so on. What I have reference to are certain policies as they related, for example, to federal highway construction, the FHA program as it was implemented in our country, and a number of other federal policies that have created very serious problems for those communities. So it seems to me that some cities are doing very well right now, and they are getting better. And some of all the programs of the 60s by no means were a failure. Many of those programs were successful. I think they were underfunded. I don't think that it is true that cities have received these huge amounts of money that we hear about so frequently. Many of the programs would have worked and would have worked even more effectively had they been adequately funded. In terms of solution, it seems to me the one thing that we've always lacked in this country, and perhaps we may be closer to it today than ever before, but we have never, ever had a comprehensive urban policy, especially at the national level. And that policy ought to include state participation, the private sector participation, and certainly organized labor. Such a policy, I think, would go a long way in finding the long-term solutions that would make most cities in this country viable again.
Father Baroni.
Well, I think it would be difficult to try to define an urban policy, Mr. Daly, because America is so diverse. And I think one of the challenges we face coming out of the fantastic conflict of civil rights, as Mayor Hatcher alluded to, in the 60s, the tremendous effect, devastating effect of the Vietnamese War, what that did on budgets and what that did to the American people and divided people, coming through Watergate. And I think America used to, land of the free, home of the brave, big, fast, growing, superpower, could do anything and could do everything. But I think the American people kind of got shocked in a sense of kind of, where are we now? And I think there's a whole question of redefinition in terms of do we have a national sense of identity? Do we have a national sense of commitment? Do we have a national sense of purpose? I agree with Mayor Hatcher that there's no policy framework. There's no general theme about urban crisis or urban policy. But I also agree with Senator Hatfield about the individuals who feel alienated and rootless. And we live in a complicated society, whether it's big big corporations, big government, complicated government. The individual, feels having a hard time dealing and interfacing with those kind of things. So I think that in terms of looking for themes, looking for a policy framework, and while I think we need national initiatives, I don't think you can cook up the menu in Washington and send it out to all the cities. I think the menu must be put together by people at the local level, and that people must be involved. Otherwise, I think big government could destroy the civility of a society. So I think that people's involvement at the local level, families, neighborhoods, is an essential ingredient. And the last thing is that I think America's got to really recognize its diversity and accept that diversity and learn to deal with that diversity.
Well, it has been argued that what's sorely needed to restore our cities, looking out into the future, is a domestic Marshall Plan, a program which we all remember restored the shattered economies in the nations of Western Europe following World War II. Now, we have two senators, two legislators with us, a member of the administration who has a good deal to say about the plans that are in prospect for the future to meet the problems, the urban problems, and we have a sitting mayor who has to meet them every day. Would you, gentlemen, any of you agree that a Marshall Plan is the solution to the problems of the future? Senator?
The Marshall Plan idea has been kicked around now for a long time, and in essence, without ever saying that this is what we were doing, that is about what we did. The amount of money now being spent by the federal government on state and local governments is between $70 and $80 billion, heading toward the $80 billion in the next fiscal year. It's come incrementally, and maybe without being called a Marshall Plan, but it's massive. I think I would agree with Father Baroni that we have such a diverse situation that trying to find the median in all these situations, we're likely to waste a lot of money and energy. I think there are some short-term emergency situations in which there are some cities that have not been viable really for a long time. They are welfare wards of the federal government as it stands, and they will continue to need considerable assistance because half of their budgets now come from the federal government. To withdraw that should create a lot of suffering. But at the same time, I think the Marshall Plan idea had better be restricted to those situations that are in extremis, and that if we're talking about an urban policy, we better begin to recognize the diversity and all the ways in which health may come, because the transfusion now of $70 to $80 billion may be, at least in terms of the total federal budget, about as high as that's likely to get, plus or minus $5 or $10 billion.
I had a momentary fear that all of us were going to be in total accord and agreement for the entire duration of this panel. That fear has been sufficiently put to rest. I'd just like to try to address this question, however. The notion, the myth, that so much money has been spent in the cities of America, and that we have reached a funding level that cannot be exceeded. First of all, I think it's important to place in perspective the $50 or $60 billion that Senator Lugar quite correctly says is being expended on various programs with the cities of America. I think that if we were to compare that expenditure with other items in the national budget, the federal budget, I think it is clear that the cities represent a very small proportion of that budget. The projected budget will be $500 billion. $60 billion does not loom so large in the face of that figure. Secondly, I think it's important to understand that as various new programs have been adopted to address the problems of the cities, and I think particularly of general revenue sharing, which was hailed as the salvation of the cities of America, that we knew as mayors that general revenue sharing was not going to turn the cities of America around, those cities that were in serious trouble. This country has never been willing to make the kind of commitment, dollar-wise, to the solution of the problems of cities that it is going to take. We must make a major long-term commitment in terms of dollars, and I'm not talking about millions of dollars, I'm talking about billions of dollars. We must lay out a 5-year, perhaps a 10-year plan to address the major problems that cities have and budget accordingly. I looked at the new budget because we are hopeful that there will be more help for the cities with the new administration. If you look at the budget, though, it is obvious that in certain areas that while the cities are being told no, certain others are being told yes. For example, we have found the money to increase our defense budget by about $11 billion. At some point, somewhere, someone made a decision that it was important that we spend an extra $11 billion on the defense budget. We have been given to understand that there will be a new, or possibly a new Department of Education, and that the education budget is going to increase by about 11%. Some have suggested it might be as high as 14%. No one recognizes the importance of education more than I do, and yet the fact is that those are extra dollars that someone found somewhere. We are going to have at least, I would suggest, a $25 billion tax cut. Again, someone made a decision that they would find the wherewithal to give that tax cut. And what I'm suggesting is that we have reached the point where we can no longer continue to say to cities, wait until next year, we'll find some money for you next year.
Father Baroni.
I think Whitney Young talked about the Marshall Plan many times. And I think there's something, though, that struck me walking around the South Bronx and in other cities. That with the Marshall Plan, we were talking about cities in Europe that were destroyed by bombs from the outside. But all of a sudden it came upon me that, we've destroyed our cities from within. And so it's not just a question of physically building and rebuilding buildings. And so we have a much more complicated, I think, human problem, people problem. And the mayor was talking about the general revenue sharing, something like $30 billion of general revenue sharing. Only 3% of that got down to poor people. And in an American society where many people, millions of people, poor people, elderly people, live without hope. And some because of poverty, some because of race, some because of both. I'm saying we need a strong top-down, national urban policy. But at the same time, I think the weakness is from the bottom up, and how to put that kind of thing together.
Senator?
I think that the Marshall Plan, again, as has been stated, gives an implication that we're going to solve our city problems strictly by an economic approach. And if we just have enough money to pour into it, we can solve it. I can't help but think of going into areas of the District of Columbia to see great housing projects that are standing empty, that have been built supposedly for those who need housing. In St. Louis, we not only built it, then we proceeded to take dynamite and blow it up after we had built it. And then I'm also aware of the fact that some of these great urban reconstruction programs, such as urban renewal, merely push the poor out of those areas where they lived, and middle class came in, or upper middle class. So we really hadn't solved the basic human problem of poverty or those who are really dispossessed. I'm reminded, too, of those who take the economic approach, that Puerto Rico took an economic approach in the 40s with an Operation Bootstrap, which was to correct all the problems of Puerto Rico with great tax benefits and tax lowers to bring industry from the mainland, to create jobs. Industry came because there was low-cost labor. Industry came because there were tax benefits. But when industry had dumped their effluent and it polluted the areas and the waters and the air, and they moved on to some other areas which were offering great lures, and today we have almost 20% unemployment in Puerto Rico. And that which was a beautiful agricultural island is now a polluted area. Now, it's not a direct analogy to all of our cities, but it's only illustrative of the fact that if one takes an economic approach solely, or put so much emphasis there that we forget the people dimension, I think we have not really solved our problems. I also would like to briefly comment about this trickle-down theory. Revenue sharing was something I voted against when it first came about because I thought the philosophy was wrong. It made the local communities more dependent upon the central government rather than less dependent. And I found that in a number of my communities, what the local governments did was to take revenue sharing and build buildings and build new city halls and build these other things that may have been needed, but they cut back on the social services that were needed, that were being shifted to the revenue sharing program of funding. So again, I emphasize that we have to keep the people dimension in all these matters, and why I feel that the best people qualified to make those determinations are perhaps the non-political groups. We're assuming that all programs have to be handled through government. There are many associational groups. There are many voluntary groups, the family, the neighborhood, the church, voluntary organizations. And I think these mediating agencies, as Berger and Newhouse talk about in their recent book, are fundamental to the ultimate solving of these problems, and perhaps resources of government can be funneled through some of these non-political groups where people really have the power and not looking only to the political institutions for that power.
I think, we've got to also appreciate that there are funds at the local level and at the state level in addition to the federal level. There are already in the budget, as I read it, I think $170 billion involved in so-called income transfer programs, which go to people principally in cities. As broadly as we define the 70% of urban areas this evening, the fact is the principal income of the principal input of the federal government into the life of urban areas, particularly in the lives of poor people, are through the income transfer payments, which are by far the largest component of the federal budget, comprising close now to 35% of every dollar that we're going to spend. And that's important. We at some point, we simply have to decide who is going to tax whom. And there always is a hope that somehow the federal government's method of collection and dispensation will be less painful.
I'd like to, first of all, suggest that we ought to understand whose money we're talking about. It's not as if the cities of America are coming hat in hand to Washington begging for a handout. We simply are asking to have a little of our own money that we sent to Washington back to do the things that we have to do. I think it is important to recognize that in the last 10, 15 years, there have been at least 3 or 4 major tax cuts at the federal level. And every time there's a tax cut at the federal level, at the local level, we have to raise property taxes, and there's no tax that is more regressive than the property tax. The fact is, we have to be the bad guys. At the local level, we have to be the bad guys and continue to raise taxes until people say, it is no longer possible for me to live in this community. I'm moving out. The taxes are too high. The second point that I think is important, and I certainly share the view that has been expressed by, I think, all members of the panel. I am not one who would suggest that money alone will solve the problem and that physically rebuilding the cities of America will solve the problem. The fact of the matter is that in order to make the other approaches work, you have to have an adequate amount of resources in order to accomplish that. General revenue sharing was in many ways a mistake, not because it attempted to provide some assistance to local communities, but because it followed the well-worn path of many federal programs and saying that everyone gets a little, no one gets enough. The fact that it was not targeted more specifically to the areas where real need exists is one of the reasons that general revenue sharing did not really work. We found communities, suburban communities in our area that were sitting around 6 months after they had received their revenue sharing entitlement, trying to figure out what to do about it. They had really difficult choices. Shall we build a golf course or shall we build a new stadium? And the fact is that there were cities a few miles away that were suffering because they did not have that money to address real people kinds of needs. So I think the targeting that was mentioned earlier is extremely important. We should make better use of the money that we're already expending on the cities. But to suggest that we are doing enough, I just don't think that is accurate.
May I suggest that, yes, Father, you
I'm going to ask Mayor Hatcher and maybe the senators as well, how do we put together the trade-offs? And how do we develop constituencies? If there's a constituency for defense, where's the constituency for an urban policy? Or is that constituency fearful, Mayor, because as you mentioned, we did have some national urban policies.
May I?
Senator?
When we begin to talk about an adjustment or an allotment of our resources, we have to come back then perhaps to an ethical question, and that is the relationship to those resources. I think basically when you begin to talk about the allocation between military and non-military goods, you come up smack dab against the military-industrial complex. You come up right face-on to all these forces that are well entrenched, verbalize, articulate their cause, well lobbied in the Congress of the nation. And then you, on the other side, find those who are without voice, who constitute the human needs of our nation. And they don't win because they are not as well organized. So I think we really have to look at this as well through these other channels, but as well we have to address ourselves to the moral ethic, to the question of a value system in this country. And that's why I think we have a non-political body. We have almost 500,000 churches and synagogues in this country. And we get very skittish when we begin to talk about the role of churches in our society because we raise all this great ogre about separation of church and state. And of course, if you go back to the Constitution, you realize that the only point made there by the Constitutional Fathers is that it shall not be an established state religion. But that did not mean that the churches and the synagogues should not have impact upon public policy. That religion was something more than a privatized experience. And I think we have to really look at those resources which can help develop a moral base, an ethical assumption, a new value system, so to speak, in order to answer these questions, because otherwise we're dealing with power structures.
May I assume that this reference to the mediating agencies, the church and the social clubs and the ancient instruments by which the American public privately have done so much to alleviate their social problems, is the real thrust of your neighborhood government bill? You'd like to see a restoration of the community, the small community of common interests, etc. Would I ask Mayor Hatcher, do you see this as a possible aid in solving some of the major problems in the cities? The mediating agencies taking a larger part of.
Well, I would certainly agree with that. I think that they could play a major role, and certainly if we began to look at the neighborhood once again as a unit, it seems to me that there is a very sound foundation there for a good deal of self-help. That is, I think it is necessary to challenge the people in our communities. If cities are to be saved, I have to agree with the idea of working from the bottom up as well as from the top down. But I think that if we challenge our people sufficiently, there is a good deal that they can do for themselves to improve the condition and quality of their lives.
Could I just interrupt one point here? Because I think when we hear such propositions as neighborhood government, we're talking about creating another echelon of political institutions that are going to have to be funded. But let me say that in this same proposal is a system of tax credits to do the very thing the mayor said. We have to empower with authority, but we have to empower with resources as well, those local and smaller units. And with a system of tax credits, we would propose that for every dollar that you contribute to that local corporation would be a dollar credit against your federal income tax, so that the more we assume of these social responsibilities at the local community level, the less requirement there is for federal involvement. And at the same time, you're transferring resources, you're transferring power. And to me, they are interlocked. You cannot transfer responsibility without resources to meet those responsibilities, which the federal government has too often tried to do to the cities.
Senator Lugar?
Apparently, I may be the only one on the panel that still believes general revenue sharing is a good thing. But I think it's a tremendously important thing. I can't imagine right now the finances of most cities in this country without general revenue sharing. And I would simply remind the panel that only 14% of the money now going to cities goes to the general revenue sharing route. 76% goes through categorical grants in which the whole grantsmanship game, competition of really who is more clever by a half is preeminent. And I think we're going to have to move into things that are more like general revenue sharing, a wind-up of categoricals, consolidation of old programs, if we're going to make headway.
I would like to suggest that I did not say that general revenue sharing was bad. I said the manner in which the program was implemented, I think, was bad, and certainly it was inadequate, dollar-wise. I'd like to move away from, if I might for a moment,
please do,
the notion of the programs, the specific programs in terms of solving the problems of the cities. And I would like to suggest that there are a number of other ways, a number of other types of reform that would probably go further in terms of solving the problems of the cities than anything we've talked about so far. First of all, tax reform. If there were real, true, major tax reform, that could probably do more for the cities than all the categorical programs put together. Secondly,
what kind of tax reform?
Well, I'll give you one example. As our tax system is presently structured, it is beneficial to a company, for example, to not locate in the city, but rather to locate further out. Their taxes are less, and they are in a position, of course, to improve their profit picture by doing so. If we could basically reverse that process in terms of the tax system, then it seems to me that would be an inducement for those companies to locate in central cities with the jobs and everything else that goes with that. The second point that I think is extremely important is that the federal government, although it certainly does not get the kind of publicity that welfare gets and that some of the other programs to help poor people gets, but the fact is the federal government helps major industry time and time again. Perhaps the most recent example of that being the steel dumping controversy that involved the national steel industry in this country. Our government came forward and said to the steel companies of America, we want to help you. We want to help you with this problem. And they have, in fact, implemented new regulations in order to provide some relief to that industry. I have no problem with that, especially coming from Gary, Indiana, where our major employer is United States Steel. But I think that it would be even better when the federal government is going to step in and assist a major national industry in that manner, that they would ask for some trade-offs. If they were to say to the steel industry, yes, we will help you if you would be willing to hire the X number of persons who have been chronically unemployed, have been unemployed for a long, long time, if you would be willing to make major investments in central cities. And one last example would be the fact that the Federal Home Loan Bank Board could put more money into the cities of America in 10 minutes than all the programs that HUD might put together for the next 5 years. And that's just a matter of policy. It's just a matter of the kinds of policies that are pursued by those agencies. So there are other ways in which cities could be helped without talking about specific categorical programs.
Let me ask you all then, are you saying that you agree substantially with the concept of an extra investment tax credit to a business which will locate in an area in which you have a high joblessness rate or which just needs to be developed, to give them at the federal level an extra investment credit and let it be a credit against 90% instead of 50% of the income taxes? Does this approach interest you?
I'm doubtful it will make much difference. As a matter of fact, I suspect that it would have to be a subsidy, and in some cases a very heavy subsidy, quite apart from the tax credit. The situation is one in which most businesses are concerned about physical safety, about the deterioration of circumstances. I think, once again, it varies as many cities as there are cities, but...
I think Mayor Hatcher, though, was talking about redlining. He was talking about financial institutions that take millions of dollars of people's money out of a neighborhood, and when those same people want to borrow that money back to fix up their house, revitalize the neighborhood, they're told, in a very disincentive kind of way, it's a wrong neighborhood, it's a changing neighborhood, it's an older neighborhood, and so they're being disinvested and in essence, redlined. And I think that's true of mortgage money, but it's also true of insurances, insurance policies and so on, the fantastic insurance redlining issue that we have. But I would propose, besides the possibility of the tax credits and some kind of economic stimulus to create jobs with industry and youth and unemployed, I've been working for about 7 years for a consumer co-op bank bill. And I think that may go through this year. And that consumer co-op bank could provide loans and technical assistance and create a self-help development fund for some of the people to do some of their own things at the local level. Because they need technical assistance, they need some know-how, they can put together housing cooperatives, health cooperatives, and do some things for themselves. And I think that would pay for itself.
Is that a variation of the Bank concept?
No, that's a separate proposal.
But is it a variation of the basic Bank concept? It's going to be capitalized out of by federal government?
Well, now this would be a cooperative bank that eventually could be self-sufficient, non-governmental, like the rural electric and rural credit, which now credit unions. Which
but initially it will be capitalized. The capital will come from public funds.
Some amount.
Senator Hatfield?
Chairman, I'd like to throw out another thought on this matter. We have been talking, because of the subject assignment, about the urban problems, but I think we have to recognize, we have to go back and find out why some of these problems have become more intense and more serious. And I think obviously one of them is the population trends in this country away from the rural areas and the smaller communities, and ask ourselves why that this has occurred in many instances. And you'll find, I believe, that as this trend continues, it exacerbates the problems within the urban centers. And so it's not an either or, but rather something that I think we have to address ourselves to as far as the total problem is concerned. Basic today, at least, to the cause of this urban trend in population is a loss in many of these smaller communities of basic facilities of adequate sewer and water. And having no adequate sewer and water systems, they find that gradually their job opportunities diminish and new jobs cannot be created by new industry or new enterprise. So consequently, they flee to the cities. The young people leave after high school. If their high school is still existing, many times they have to be bussed into a more urban setting for even high school. So I feel that one of the real things we have to do is to address ourselves to some of the rural, smaller community problems in order to really, in a comprehensive way, attack the problems of the urban center. We're interrelated, we're interdependent in that sense.
I think we've developed many major aspects of our overall problem, and it is time to open the question and answer session. All right, may I have the first question, please?
My name is Silberman. I should like to ask the panel the question as to whether it is clear at all that there is such a thing as an urban crisis, and whether we shouldn't be terribly glad that the American people are exercising quite clearly and rationally their intelligence and their right to move away from areas which are subject to high tax and other aspects of urban living which are relatively unfavorable. Now, I gather that Father Baroni would expand the number of people in HUD engaged in various federal programs to provide services to prison those people there. I gather Mayor Hatcher would be perfectly willing to let them leave if federal funds came in dollar per person. I gather that Senator Lugar has in mind lassoing them into a metropolitan area, and as best I can gather, Senator Hatfield would let them go as long as they don't come to Oregon.
Thank you.
But my question is this a bad process? Shouldn't people be permitted? And indeed, should we not try to discourage them from going where economic opportunity is and where more favorable economic and social situations are?
And I think, gentlemen, we can assume that the question also covers what it now appears to be a migration back into the cities. Who would like to start it?
Okay. Well, I would I would only like to make one brief comment. I think that what the gentleman has asked for is to sustain mobility for our people to make decisions where they would choose to live. The only problem we have there is that the poor usually lose that right of mobility because they get locked in too frequently and they do not have the freedom of choice. But in addition, I would indicate, as I had earlier, that's why I think we cannot address ourselves to, quote, the urban problem without looking at the total problem of where people live, be it in a central city or in a suburban area or in a rural area, because much of the mobility that people might desire goes beyond the city boundaries, goes beyond even the county. And I'd like to see it so that there are viable alternatives because of job opportunities in all of these areas in order to sustain the freedom of mobility for people.
Senator Lugar?
Simply to follow up, I would agree that the problem is not an urban problem, but a people problem in terms of equity, of giving every American the right to move out of a city if he or she wants to do that, and likewise possibility of moving back in or staying, going to the suburbs. I don't buy for a moment that we ought to have a policy that is an urban policy as opposed to a rural policy or a suburban policy, or make the judgments between these arrangements. But I agree the question is of equity is making certain that everyone really has this mobility, that we're not entrapping any one particular group of people within cities.
Mayor?
Well, I would just, I was really trying to figure out a way to make use of what you suggested. If I could get $1 for every person that left, I would really want to figure a way to have that same group of people move back in and then move out again and back in. And eventually, I'm sure we'd have enough money to address the problem. I want to tell you that the out-migration, first to the suburbs and then, as Senator Lugar implies, even beyond that, I would agree, I think, with what your statement or question implies, if I could feel that that was a natural phenomenon. But I am convinced that it was not. For example, we hear a great deal of talk about people moving from the frost belt to the sun belt, and that the sun belt is now booming and prospering. I happen to believe that cities like New York, Milwaukee, and other cities in the Midwest and Northeast subsidize and are subsidizing the growth of the Southwest and the Western states. One need only take a look at where most major federal facilities have gone in the last 20 years. And you know that when a major Army base, for example, is constructed, that means thousands of jobs are going to be located in that area, and other types of federal facilities. Most of them have gone to the Southwest and to the West. And so it is no accident that people left the Midwest and left the Northeast seeking better opportunities, just as they came many earlier, in an earlier period, from rural areas into the cities, seeking better opportunities. Now, I have no criticism of the fact that this has happened, but I don't think we ought to delude ourselves into thinking that that was simply a flight to the sun, because it wasn't. It was an effort to improve the lives of people, and that played a major role in their moving. Now, having said that, it seems to me that it is only fair that if we subsidize their growth, the time has now come for them to subsidize our revival. And so it seems to me that we must adopt policies, first of all at the federal level, of course, that will now shift the procurement practices, shift the installations, the major federal installations, from that area to the areas of the older cities, and bring those jobs into that area. That would be a big help to us. And secondly, we cannot, I stress this again, we cannot continue to take this approach that every time we expend a tax dollar, a public dollar, that we are going to spread it out so that everybody gets some. We've got to target and emphasize the use of those funds in the areas where the needs are greatest. And hopefully the representatives, the senators from those areas will understand that and would be willing to support that approach to the solution of these problems.
Father Baroni.
I think the mayor's right in saying we're all in this together, in a sense. When you think of places of the Bronx or Lawndale or many places in our cities where people go to bed at night wondering if there is police protection or fire protection, wondering whether there is any governance. And I think that's a disaster sign, whether you move to Arizona or wherever you move, that on the body politic there's that kind of cancer of no governance. And I think that's very, very dangerous kind of symptom, so that we are all in this together. Mumford used to say, and anybody who's lived in an inner city, in terms of people being locked in, when you looked at that loneliness or that despair, when you looked at that overcrowding, when you looked at all those forces that spawn misery in that so-called human thing called the city, then you have to ask yourself, that we as a great American society cannot ignore our responsibility wherever we live, rural, north, south, east, or west. So that I think that we all have to somehow recognize this interdependence.
May I have the next question, please? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, my name is Beverly Charles, and I'm a legislative assistant to Senator Jacob K. Javits of New York. I have two questions. One, what do you mean when you say revitalization of the cities? Do you mean return them to the splendor they once had as industrial centers, or do you mean to view them in a new light as consumer centers where people receive services, centers where people go for vacation because it's an exciting place to be and because they have excellent theaters, symphonies, etc. The other question is, why hasn't the Department of Interior, who gets a substantial amount of money from the U.S. government, been exploited for the opportunity or vehicle that it can be? And that is, it seems to me that a great deal of the Department of Interior funding goes to western or rural areas in terms of national parks and national forests, but that the recreation potential of revitalizing cities has not been explored adequately. And I'd like members of the panel to address those two questions, please. Thank you.
Who'd like to start?
Well,
Mayor?
I will try to respond to your second question. First, I think slowly that shift is beginning to take place, and there is recognition that there is tremendous recreational potential in urban areas. Your first question, though, is an interesting one, because I think that there is a tendency sometime for us to, when we talk about rebuilding the cities, to think of the cities as they used to be. I don't think cities ever will be as they used to be again. I think that there will be greater emphasis on recreation. The problem that I have with that right now is that many of the people who use the services of the cities do not help to pay for those services. They do not contribute anything to the provision of those services. And again, we get back to some of these regional arrangements. It's going to take something like that to make certain that those cities can continue to provide the services.
All right, we have the next question, please.
Charlene Hemming, Chair, the Chicano Forum. I would like to address what Mayor Hatcher seemed to have addressed. I do disagree with you, and I'd like all the other members of the panel, please, especially you, Father Baroni, to address what I'm going to say. I have found in my advocacy for the Hispanic community, the majority being Chicanos from the Southwest, I have run into a complicated regionalism spirit. And I would wonder how in the world an urban policy, and especially implementation, could ever succeed in terms of the regionalism that we face now. Because in the inner city, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, here in Washington, and in New York, the blacks are fighting the browns. And the majority of your inner city crises is facing this. In facing this, you're going to have to deal with this at the level of the urban policy. How can you possibly address this factor? Thank you.
Father Baroni, you want to start?
Well, I think the Kerner Commission talked about that in its report 10 years ago, when it talked about what seemed to be the inevitable group conflict between rising expectations of minorities and lower middle working class whites and so on. But I thought you were going to ask, Charlene, in a sense, how do you deal with the cultural differences as well that exist, Los Angeles, Northeast, Southwest, and so on, And that's another point I think is very important we left out here, that we've never really seen ourselves as a cultural democracy. I think American Indians understood that, other groups as well. So I am interested that we not only deal with economic, social issues, but there's a great cultural kind of issue that America has to deal with that's located in its families, in its groups, in its diversity, and all of that pluralism that we have. So I was raised to melt or get off the pot, and I'm against the melting pot kind of tradition. But I do agree with you that the only way that we're going to deal with that so-called inevitable group conflict is to find bridge issues or convergent issues or joint issues between groups. And lots of times that is jobs and housing and education and health and so on. So that we begin to have policies that relate to that, and at the same time respecting a lot of what you might call the valued variance of cultural diversity and pluralism, because I think that can make America very exciting and so on. But we do have that inevitable group conflict. I think that's one of the reasons that many of our cities had so much trouble. We could not deal with those group conflicts, particularly when they became racial, as well as class and whatever else. But I think that's a new challenge. I think that's a new kind of a thing that has to be part of a theme of national revitalization or national urban policy that respects that kind of diversity and begins to create economic policies to eliminate some of the group conflict.
Mayor?
Yes, I would certainly endorse everything that Father Baroni said except one word, and that was the inevitable conflict. I don't think it's inevitable. I think that the primary basis for the conflict, as we have seen it not only in the so-called Sunbelt states, but really all over the country, is economic. I think that it is a matter of two groups fighting over scraps while everyone else eats steak. And I think the way you solve that problem is to get some steak for both those groups. And it seems to me that will resolve the conflict.
This concludes another public policy forum presented by the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research. On behalf of AEI, our heartfelt thanks to the distinguished and expert panelists, Mayor Richard G. Hatcher, Senator Mark Hatfield, Senator Richard Lugar, and Father Geno Baroni. And by the way, our thanks too to our guests and experts in the audience for their participation.
This public policy forum on the future of urban centers has brought you the views of 4 experts. It was presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute. It is the aim of AEI to clarify the issues of the day by presenting many viewpoints, in the hope that by so doing, those who wish to learn about the decision-making process will benefit from such a free exchange of informed and enlightened opinion. I'm Peter Hackus in Washington.
This Public Policy Forum series is created and supplied to this station as a public service by the American Enterprise Institute, Washington, D.C. For a transcript of this program, send $3.75 to the American Enterprise Institute, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036.